Today we will be going over the fourth video in section 2, creating content and adding collections, integrating with external services. We are going to create a Meteor server-only service from scratch that's going to interact with our existing Meteor application. In order to do that, it will connect to our existing application using DDP, and we'll show you how that's done. And the new service will listen in on the data, and based off of any changes to the snippets collection, it will insert and become a helper for the content of any of those snippets. What we want to happen is anytime that a URL is submitted, we want to be able to turn that into a link rather than just text. So in our current application, if we add, for example, http://meteor.com, it's text just like anything else. We can click on it, but it doesn't take us anywhere. This makes us sad panda. We definitely want to be able to have any links inside our snippets just automatically go across. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a new Meteor application, Meteor create URL checker. We're going to go into that directory and we're going to remove everything, all of the different files inside of there, and we will make one directory, which is the server directory. Remember, this is going to be a server-only application or a server-only service. So inside of our URL checker folder, inside of our server folder, we're going to create a file and we will call this url-service.js. Okay. We need to create a connection to our existing service. And we will do that by declaring a variable con, and we will use DDP connect. And notice we're connecting to localhost 3000. That's where our current application is being served from. So now we're going to call a regular snippets collection, just like we would normally, new mongo.collection. And we're going to add the snippets channel. But this time we're going to add the connection as an additional argument. And this is going to say, hey, this collection already exists and it's already being served by this connection object, which is localhost 3000. So we need a little bit of admin security. So the best way to do that, to create a login, is through our UI. So we're going to go ahead and create admin@test.com with a password of Meteor. Now, user IDs are handled inside of Meteor using tokens. So we need to keep track of any token that we have. We're going to declare a little tiny collection here, a Mongo collection user tokens, and we're going to see if a token exists. If the token doesn't exist, we're going to go ahead and initiate a login, and otherwise we're going to try to log in with that particular token. Okay. So if we have a valid token, then we're going to go ahead and proceed. So we're going to go ahead and say, if we do have a token, we are going to subscribe using that connection again to the snippets channel, just like we would on a regular client. So in this case, the server is actually acting as a client. And in the function, we want to be able to subscribe specifically to snippets find. And this creates a cursor. This cursor becomes very important because we're going to be listening to anything happening on the server side coming in from that snippets collection. So we're going to use a snippets.find observe changes. We can observe changes on deletes, on edits, and also on adds. So we are going to be listening for any new objects that are created inside of the snippets collection. And as they are added, we're going to make sure, number one, that they're valid, that there is something in the text field, and also that they don't have a URL. If they have a URL or if there's nothing in the text field, we're just going to return. Now, in the condition where there is something in the text field, we want to check to see if it's URL. So this is a little bit overly simplified. We could use a regular expression, but we're just going to do a simple index of for HTTP. If it exists, then if it's at the beginning of that particular text, then we're going to go ahead and add now a URL property to that particular collection. So we'll say surl equals stext, and then we're going to wrap this inside of a try just to make it a little bit less flimsy. It's very flimsy at this point, but it's just for illustrative purposes, so bear with us. We're going to do a snippets update, and we have the ID already, and we need to make sure that we update by ID because we're updating as a client. Remember that even though this is a service, it's acting as a client. So we will update ID is equal to the ID that was passed in. And then we will do a set statement for S. We've just updated S and set it in a set statement. Now, if there's any kind of error, we're going to log it to the console, and this will allow our application to keep running because it's inside of a try-catch block. So we'll give it some context here. We'll say there was an error updating, and we will pass in what the specific error message is. So just in case we run into any problems as we are trying to debug, we'll have the ID, and then we'll also be able to see what the error was specifically for that particular update. Let's be good syntax citizens and add our semicolons where they're needed. Now, if you remember up above, we declared init login and a login with token, but we haven't yet actually fleshed out those functions. So that's what we're going to do next. Just below our conditional statement, we'll go ahead and create the function init login. And because we're declaring it as function init login, we can actually flesh this out after we've already made a call to it inside of our conditional above. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is in that connection, we're going to call login. We're going to pass the user, which is just an email address. And remember, we used admin@test.com. And we're going to go ahead and pass in a plain words password. Now, don't worry too much about this. If you are worried about a production application and you want to make it a lot more secure, there are significantly better or significantly more secure ways to pass in a login token. We're just using this for illustrative purposes, and we could make it much more secure if we wanted to. Okay, so when we call login, the results we get back are asynchronous. So there's a callback function. Inside of this callback function, there are two parameters that are passed. One is an error object and one is a result object. If there was any kind of error, then the error object will not be null. So this is what we're checking for here. If error does exist, we're going to go ahead and go into the console and we're going to say error logging in. And to bring it to somebody's attention, actually, we're going to capitalize, make all caps the error. Okay. And then we will specifically pass what the error was so that we can debug if need be. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and return if that's the case. Otherwise, we'll get a result guaranteed. So if we don't get an error, we will get a result. And if we don't get a result, we will get an error. Okay, so we're going to take that result and we are going to store this inside of our tokens collection. Okay, remember we want to keep this token for future use. So we're going to use an upsert statement in case it already exists for the resultant user ID, which is the result.id, and we're going to set the result, which is the object itself that came back. Plain and simple, we don't need to fuss about how specifically it's stored because we just need the token off of it. Okay, now to log in with the token, we are going to declare our function, again using function login token syntax because we already have referenced it above. Okay, the token is passed into the login function, and we're going to do the same kind of connection call that we did before, but this time instead of just doing a plain login, we're going to do a resume. So instead of passing a user ID and a password, we're now going to pass the token under the name value pair of resume. So the key for that is resume. Right? Same thing here, we have an asynchronous function. If an error exists, then we want to know about it. We want to log that to the console, but we may encounter a condition where we were just trying to log in with an invalid token. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to clean out our tokens collection, okay? And we're going to log and say, hey, we had an error logging in with a particular token. That's not too big of a deal because we still have our last resort, which is to do an init login. If, on the other hand, the token was able to resume our login, then we want to restore it in case there were any updates to it. So we'll do that familiar token upsert using the user ID that came in on the result. And we will again do a set with the result. Okay, again, we want to be good syntax citizens, so let's consolidate things a little bit here, add a semicolon. You know what, let's even add a little comment inside of here to let everybody know that, hey, if we initially logged in with token and it didn't work, then we're going to log in with an init login, which is the user ID and password. Now that login's taken care of, we need to go back to our service or our initial application, and we need to allow update. Now remember, this service is going to update the URL, so we need to allow for this. So inside of our snippets.allow, we're going to say, okay, if you want to update, you need to make sure that you have a user ID. So if the user ID is null, then we will return false. In other words, nobody's logged in. And if the user ID is not null, then we will return true. In other words, you can update as long as you're logged in. I've got a little bit of cleanup work to do here. We've got some syntax issues. So let's go ahead and take care of those real quick. All right, we need to make sure we encapsulate that ID inside of some tags, some JSON tags. And it looks like we also need to pass in with the login with token. We need to pass in the token, obviously. Okay, great. All right, so our next problem that we actually have is, if you remember, on our original application, we are only publishing the results for the logged in user. Okay, so we need to actually create a new publish statement, because remember, we're working as an admin here and we need to see everything. So we're going to go ahead and create meteor.publish snippets-admin. So this is a new channel, a new published channel that only the snippets admin or our server-only service can see. And we're going to create a function here, and we're just going to do a simple return snippets.find. Okay, this will return everything back instead of just the things that are owned by the logged in user. We need to make that change inside of our URL service.js file as well, under the subscribe function. Okay, remember we were subscribing to snippets. We now need to subscribe to snippets admin. That's the only change we really need to make. Our service should be ready now, so we'll go ahead and go into the command line, and we will run Meteor on a different port, Meteor --port 1337. So our application is up and running, and it should now be combing over those results and adding a URL. Now this isn't reflected in our UI just yet, but if we go into the command line on our client and we do a snippets.find.fetch so that we get all the results back, we'll get 3 objects because we have 3 snippets, and you will notice that there is a URL. Okay, so that URL was actually added. If it wasn't a URL to begin with, then the URL's property is not added to the object. So depending on what we add inside of here, if we add a new one, let's say http://packedpub.com, go ahead and add that, and it should be pretty instantaneous. Okay, so if we rerun our find fetch and look at the last result, we'll actually put it into a table so we can see all the results at once. So we'll put that in a console table. And notice over here, if the text contained HTTP, the URL has been provided. So our service is up and running properly. Through observed changes on the cursor, we are looking into the added function and adding the SURL as necessary. So now we want to be able to display this properly in our UI. So we're going to go into our each snippets inside of our tmpl-snippets.html file, and we're going to add a conditional. Now, normally we might want to add something like if URL, but we want to add an additional helper inside of here just to make it a little bit cleaner. So instead of just checking for URL, we're going to say if is link. In other words, if a URL exists, and we'll create that helper in just a moment. But if is link is true, then we, instead of having a div to just display, we're now going to create a hyperlink using ahref. So here we have the a and the href, and we're going to put in, you guessed it, the URL property into that href. And then we'll go ahead and display the text inside of that. We'll actually wrap this div inside of it, and we might as well reuse the div that's there. We will want an else statement, because if it's not a link, if the URL doesn't exist, then we want to display as normal. So we'll go ahead and end our if statement. We'll create a little room inside of there, and we will copy that self-same div into our else statement. So now that we've updated our HTML template, we need to go update our helpers for that isLink boolean. Okay, so we're going into our TMPL snippets.js file. We'll add an isLink function, and we will simply return inside of here whether or not URL exists. Now, the great thing about Meteor is, as we're going through this it creates a data context. That means that we can reference the existing data for this individual row just by putting in a this.data.url. So we'll set our conditional here, and if it's undefined, then we're going to return false. If it's not undefined, then we're going to return true. Looking back over the HTML template, it looks like we accidentally added a hash to our else, so let's take that off. And one other change we need to make inside of TMPL snippets.js, we actually don't need to reference this.data.url, it's just this.url. Okay, the data is implied. All right, so let's log in with a user2@test.com. Okay, we'll add that password inside of there. And now when we add a http://meteor, lo and behold, the link appears properly and it looks like a hyperlink. We'll try it with packedpub.com and go ahead and click on that to see if we go to Packed Publishing. And there we go, www.packedpub.com. Looks like everything's working properly. Our service is running and our UI template is now updating properly for isLink. So we created a server-only service from scratch that's able to connect to our existing application through DDP using a syntax that's familiar to us because we used it when we built our client. So the server, even though it is a server, is acting as a DDP client and is subscribing to any changes happening to the snippets collection on the remote server. If it finds a new snippet, in other words, if something was added, it checks to see if the text field contains HTTP, and if so, it will add the URL property to the snippet in the collection using a snippets.update. We modified our existing application code to allow for these updates coming from that external service, and we also updated our HTML template with a conditional to display a link if the URL exists.